Imagine standing at a border, not just any border, but the line where one world ends and another begins. Throughout history, these lines, sometimes rivers, sometimes walls, sometimes invisible ideas, have shaped human existence in profound ways. They've been barriers and bridges, battlegrounds and symbols, sites of conflict and cooperation. But what makes a border, and how have borders evolved alongside us? From the winding rivers of early civilizations to the biometric scanners of today, borders tell a story, not just about geography, but about who we are, what we value, and how we navigate the complex intersections of identity, power, and belonging. In this exploration, we'll traverse time, diving into 9 pivotal eras where borders transformed from natural barriers to militarized divides, from symbols of unity to contested battlegrounds for our future. We'll see how rivers like the Nile once unified communities through shared survival, how walls like the Great Wall of China symbolized power and control, and how modern borders balance openness and restriction in the face of globalization and technology. Each step in this journey reveals a triad, a set of 3 interlocking forces that define the borders of their time. These triads show us how geography, identity, resources, conflict, and innovation weave together to create the borders we live with today. But this isn't just a history lesson. Borders are living, evolving entities. They are mirrors of human ambition, fear, and ingenuity. And as we step into an age of globalization, climate change, and cyber realities, borders are not just physical anymore. They're virtual, ideological, and deeply contested. So let's embark on this journey together. Let's explore the lines that divide and unite us, the choices that created them, and the insights they offer for our shared future. After all, understanding borders is about more than tracing a map. It's about understanding ourselves. Let's begin. In the earliest days of human civilization, borders were not drawn with rulers and maps. They were carved by rivers, mountains, and deserts, natural features that shaped where people lived, how they survived, and who they became. These natural boundaries formed the earliest borders, not as rigid lines, but as zones of coexistence between geography, resources, and community identity. Take rivers, for example. The Nile, with its fertile floodplains, wasn't just a source of water. It was the heartbeat of ancient Egypt. Its predictable flooding provided rich soil for agriculture, sustaining an economy that allowed communities to thrive. But it was more than just a practical resource. The Nile inspired myths, rituals, and even the Egyptians' understanding of time itself. It wasn't merely a border between desert and farmland, it was a symbol of life, unity, and the divine. Mountains and deserts, on the other hand, played a different role. These features offered protection from invaders, but also limited interaction with neighboring groups, fostering distinct cultural identities. In the case of Egypt, the deserts on either side of the Nile acted as natural fortresses, preserving a unique culture while defining the land that was habitable and arable. This interplay between geography and resources directly influenced the cohesion of early societies. Shared reliance on vital resources like water not only bound communities together, but also gave rise to collaborative survival practices. From cooperative irrigation systems to shared agricultural strategies, these necessities forged a sense of identity rooted in mutual reliance. Distinct geography also shaped the identities of communities themselves. In Egypt, the division between Upper and Lower Egypt reflected the Nile's geography, with each region developing unique political and cultural traits. Yet the Nile unified these regions, facilitating communication, trade, and a shared worldview that eventually led to the creation of one of history's first centralized states. The borders of early societies were not the rigid lines we think of today. They were fluid, shaped by the environment and open to adaptation. Rivers and mountains didn't separate people as much as they defined where they could live, thrive, and connect. These natural boundaries created cohesion, fostering localized governance systems built on the shared management of resources rather than centralized control. The Nile River exemplifies this beautifully. It was not only a geographic feature, but the lifeblood of a civilization, a natural border that unified rather than divided, enabling Egypt to become a flourishing center of culture and power. The lesson here is simple but profound. Early borders emerged not from human imposition, but from collaboration with the natural world. Geography, resources, and community identity intertwined to create not just survival, but meaning. These early boundaries laid the groundwork for more structured borders, teaching us that borders can both unify and define, shaping the story of humanity from its very beginnings. As human societies grew into sprawling empires, the challenges of maintaining control over vast territories brought forth a pivotal innovation: fortified boundaries. These were not just barriers of stone and mortar, they were expressions of power, strategy, and ambition. They reinforced the triad of defense, governance, and infrastructure, transforming the concept of borders into something deliberate, visible, and enduring. At their core, fortified boundaries addressed a fundamental need: defense. Empires faced constant threats from external invaders, and walls became their first line of protection. But walls were more than physical barriers, they symbolized the might of a ruler. Coordinating their construction required centralized authority, military organization, and administrative power. The Great Wall of China is a striking example. Initially built by feudal states to deter nomadic incursions, it was later unified under imperial leadership, showcasing the centralization of governance required to manage such a monumental project. This brings us to governance. Once empires centralized their power, they could orchestrate large-scale projects like the construction of walls, roads, and watchtowers. Infrastructure became the lifeblood of governance, demonstrating a ruler's ability to manage resources and labor while ensuring the empire's stability. The Great Wall exemplifies this. With its network of garrisons and signal towers, it wasn't just a wall, it was an integrated system that extended imperial control into remote regions. Infrastructure also fed back into defense. Roads and supply lines enhanced the mobility of troops and the empire's ability to respond to threats. Watchtowers enabled swift communication, giving defenders the strategic advantage of timely intelligence. The synergy between walls and infrastructure turned borders into dynamic zones of activity, not static lines. Fortified boundaries like the Great Wall marked a profound evolution in the perception of borders. Unlike natural boundaries, which were shaped by geography, these were human constructs, deliberate, static, and designed to make a statement. They were physical manifestations of power and psychological deterrence, projecting authority outward while providing a sense of security within. But these walls were more than functional. They were symbols of identity and unity, reinforcing the idea of a bounded community. For the Qin and later dynasties, the Great Wall was a tool for consolidating smaller defensive structures into a unified strategy, reflecting the empire's political and cultural cohesion. The lesson here is that fortified boundaries were about more than keeping invaders out. They were expressions of an empire's ability to shape the physical world to its will, to impose order on chaos. They reveal the interplay of defense, governance, and infrastructure in solidifying the power of ancient states. The Great Wall of China, towering over the landscape, tells this story vividly. It protected against external threats, integrated the empire's territories, and became a lasting testament to the ambition and ingenuity of the rulers who built it. These fortified borders paved the way for the more sophisticated systems of control and governance that would define the empires to come. In the end, fortified boundaries remind us that borders are more than barriers. They are reflections of human determination to define, protect, and project power. And in their stones and mortar, they hold the echoes of the societies that built them. In the medieval world, borders were neither rigid lines on a map nor towering walls stretching across the horizon. Instead, they were zones of influence shaped by the intricate web of feudal relationships, of loyalty, land ownership, and security. These borders reflected a decentralized, hierarchical system where power was local, personal, and tied to the land. At the heart of this system was land ownership. In a world where agriculture was the cornerstone of the economy, land was the most valuable resource a ruler could offer. It was both an incentive and a tool of control. Lords granted land to vassals in exchange for their loyalty and service, creating a chain of dependency that held the feudal structure together. Without land, vassals lacked the means to sustain themselves, and without vassals, lords lacked the power to defend their domains. This dynamic is vividly illustrated in the Welsh Marches, a volatile borderland between England and Wales. Here, the English crown granted territories to the Marcher lords, who acted as semi-independent rulers. Their loyalty was secured by the land they controlled, land that sustained their households and financed their military obligations. In this way, land ownership was not just an economic arrangement, but the glue that held the feudal system together. But owning land meant little without security. The medieval landscape was rife with threats from rival lords to rebellious subjects. Castles, the architectural icons of the feudal era, were the linchpins of security. These fortresses served as defensive strongholds, administrative centers, and symbols of authority. In the Welsh marches, castles like Caernarfon and Conwy stood as bastions against Welsh resistance, ensuring that the lords could maintain control over their territories. Without such defenses, the land was vulnerable to conquest and chaos, undermining the entire system. The system was equally reliant on loyalty. Feudal borders depended on the mutual obligations between lords and vassals, protection in exchange for service. When this loyalty faltered, the defensive network crumbled. Disloyal vassals weakened the chain of command, leading to fragmentation and internal strife. In border regions like the Welsh marches, loyalty to the English crown ensured the region's function as a buffer zone. If that loyalty wavered, so too did the security and stability of the borderlands. This feedback loop between loyalty, land ownership, and security defined feudal borders. They were not static. They shifted with the fortunes of alliances, the rise and fall of lords, and the tides of local conflict. Borders were defined by the extent of a lord's influence and the loyalty of their vassals, creating a fluid and dynamic system. The Welsh marches epitomized this feudal reality. The crown's grants of land secured the loyalty of the marcher lords. The lords in turn built and maintained castles to defend their holdings. These interconnected elements created a borderland that was both a defensive buffer and a semi-autonomous region. The lesson of feudal borders is one of interdependence. The triad of loyalty, land, and security reveals a system where power was localized, relationships were paramount, and borders were dynamic zones of influence. This decentralized model set the stage for the emergence of more centralized nation-states, where borders would evolve into fixed, legally defined entities. In the medieval world, borders were not just about land. They were about the relationships that made that land meaningful. And through those relationships, the feudal system left an enduring mark on the history of borders, shaping the foundations of the modern world. As the Renaissance swept across Europe and the early modern period unfolded, the very concept of borders underwent a radical transformation. No longer fluid zones defined by natural geography or feudal allegiances, borders began to take on the form we recognize today, formalized, fixed, and legally codified. This shift was powered by the triad of sovereignty, trade, and diplomacy, forces that interwove to create the modern nation-state. At the heart of this transformation was sovereignty, the assertion of centralized authority within defined borders. Sovereign states had the power to enforce laws, regulate commerce, and protect their economies. The Treaty of Westphalia in 1648 was a turning point, marking the end of the 30 Years' War and formalizing the principle of state sovereignty. It granted nations the autonomy to control trade routes and impose tariffs, providing the stability necessary for economic growth. In essence, sovereignty created the framework for nations to define their borders and govern their internal affairs without external interference. This newfound control over borders fueled trade, as states used their authority to manage economic activities. Fixed borders allowed for the regulation of commerce, fostering mutual prosperity. Economic interests, in turn, drove nations to seek stability through treaties and alliances. Diplomacy became a vital tool for resolving trade disputes and ensuring the smooth flow of goods and resources. The post-Westphalian era saw the rise of commercial agreements that balanced national interests with international cooperation, reducing the reliance on warfare as a means of settling conflicts. But sovereignty and trade alone were not enough to create the system of borders we know today. Diplomacy played a crucial role in turning borders from contested spaces into recognized entities. Before Westphalia, Europe was a patchwork of fragmented regions, prone to conflict and lacking coherent representation in international affairs. Sovereignty provided states with the legitimacy to engage in diplomatic negotiations, while trade provided the incentive to do so. Treaties like those following Westphalia formalized borders, reducing ambiguity and creating a foundation for peace. The interaction of sovereignty, trade and diplomacy laid the groundwork for the modern concept of borders as fixed political constructs. For the first time, borders were not just geographic or cultural markers, but legal entities recognized and respected by other nations. This system created centralized authority, enabling states to manage their territories effectively while fostering economic and diplomatic interdependence. The Treaty of Westphalia epitomizes this transformation. It enshrined the idea of state sovereignty, giving nations control over their internal affairs and the power to regulate trade within their borders. It also demonstrated the importance of diplomacy, ending decades of war through negotiation rather than further bloodshed. By solidifying borders and formalizing statehood, Westphalia marked the birth of the modern international system, a system where borders were no longer simply lines on a map, but reflections of legal and political reality. The lesson of this era is clear. The stability and growth of nations depend on the interplay of sovereignty, trade, and diplomacy. Sovereignty provides the foundation, trade drives mutual interests, and diplomacy ensures cooperation and conflict resolution. Together, these forces transform borders into tools for governance, commerce, and peace, paving the way for the nation-state system that shapes our world today. This period reminds us that borders are not just barriers. They are frameworks for order and opportunity, reflecting the aspirations and negotiations of those who define them. Through sovereignty, trade, and diplomacy, humanity turned boundaries into bridges, crafting a system that continues to influence how we coexist on this shared planet. The colonial era redrew the map of the world, not with the interests of local populations in mind, but to serve the ambitions of imperial powers. These borders, carved in boardrooms and sealed with treaties, were not guided by cultural, geographic, or historical realities. Instead, they were driven by the triad of imperialism, exploitation, and artificial division, forces that left a lasting legacy of conflict, instability, and division. At the heart of colonial border-making was imperialism, the expansion of European powers into Asia, Africa, and the Americas. Colonial empires sought to control vast territories, claiming lands to cement their influence and assert dominance. The Berlin Conference of 1884-85 stands as a stark example of this process. European leaders divided Africa into territories, drawing borders that disregarded existing ethnic or cultural boundaries. This scramble for Africa ensured that the map reflected European spheres of influence rather than the realities of the people who lived there. But imperialism was not an end in itself. It was fueled by exploitation, the relentless extraction of resources and labor from colonized regions. Colonial borders were often drawn with economic interests in mind, whether it was diamonds in South Africa, gold in Ghana, or rubber in the Congo. These borders facilitated the flow of wealth from the colonies to the imperial centers, often at a devastating cost to local populations. In the Congo Free State, borders were crafted to maximize access to resources, enforced by brutal regimes that prioritized profit over human life. To maintain control and ensure the smooth operation of this exploitative system, colonial powers imposed artificial divisions. These divisions ignored natural and cultural continuities, creating fractures that weakened local resistance and facilitated governance. In Rwanda, colonial administrators institutionalized ethnic divisions between the Hutus and Tutsis, fostering tensions that exploded into one of the most devastating genocides of the 20th century. These artificial borders and divisions were tools of imperial strategy, but their effects lingered long after colonial powers retreated. The result of this triad was a legacy of instability. Colonial borders were arbitrary and artificial, often dividing cohesive ethnic groups or lumping rival groups together. These boundaries prioritized economic extraction over the creation of sustainable governance structures, leaving newly independent nations with weak institutions and simmering conflicts. In Nigeria, the borders drawn by colonial powers contributed to ethnic and religious tensions, leading to civil war, and ongoing struggles for national cohesion. The Berlin Conference encapsulates this tragic history. It formalized the partition of Africa without input from African leaders or consideration of African realities. Its borders served imperial ambitions and facilitated exploitation, creating fractures that still define the continent's political and social landscape. The lesson of colonial borders is sobering. They remind us that borders imposed from above without regard for local contexts can create enduring harm. These lines were not just marks on a map, they were tools of domination, extraction and division, and their legacy persists as nations continue to grapple with the challenges of governance, identity, and unity within the frameworks imposed by colonial powers. Colonial borders were a product of their time, shaped by greed and geopolitical competition. But as we look back, they also challenge us to think about how borders are created and the responsibilities that come with drawing them. They remind us that borders are more than boundaries. They are stories of power and consequence, written on the land and in the lives of those who live within them. The industrial era was a time of extraordinary transformation. Economic innovation and rapid urbanization reshaped societies, and borders took on new significance as tools for managing the complex forces of nationalism, economic growth, and urban expansion. Yet this period also revealed the tensions that such changes could bring, as borders became symbols of identity and battlegrounds for power. At the heart of this transformation was nationalism, which intertwined the fate of borders with the soul of emerging nation-states. Industrialization fueled pride in national achievements, and borders became markers of identity and unity. Governments stoked this nationalism through education, propaganda, and policies that tied industrial progress to national strength. Nowhere was this more apparent than in the relationship between France and Germany, two nations whose borders became symbols of rivalry and resilience. The contested Alsace-Lorraine region epitomized the era's nationalistic fervor, its control hotly contested as both countries sought to claim it as a symbol of their cultural and industrial superiority. This national pride was closely tied to economic growth, as industrial wealth reshaped borders into instruments of regulation and control. The rise of factories and resource extraction drove governments to formalize trade policies and assert control over industrial zones. For France and Germany, this dynamic created both interdependence and competition. The industrial powerhouse of the Ruhr Valley, lying near their shared border, became a focal point for economic ambition and geopolitical tension. Borders in this era were not merely administrative, they were strategic assets, crucial for controlling resources and sustaining national economies. Urbanization further magnified the impact of borders, as growing cities near industrial zones became flashpoints for both collaboration and conflict. Urban centers along the Franco-German border, like Strasbourg and Metz, embodied the era's tensions. These cities were cultural and economic hubs, their fortunes tied to the shifting borders of their parent nations. The industrialization of these regions attracted labor, investment, and infrastructure, but it also deepened nationalistic rivalries. The cities became symbols of progress, but also reminders of the fragility of borders in a time of rapid change. The convergence of nationalism, economic growth, and urbanization solidified borders as more than geographical lines. They became sites of identity, power, and conflict. Economically, borders regulated trade and controlled vital industrial zones. Culturally, they symbolized national pride and unity, but politically, they often heightened tensions, creating divisions that set the stage for global conflicts like World War I and World War II. The lesson of industrial borders is one of ambition and consequence. The triad of nationalism, economic growth, and urbanization reveals how borders can inspire progress while also sowing discord. France and Germany's contested border regions serve as a stark reminder that when borders become battlegrounds for national identity, they can drive not just innovation but division. In the industrial era, borders reflected humanity's potential for growth and its capacity for conflict. They remind us that borders are not just lines to cross or defend, they are mirrors of the aspirations, struggles, and challenges of the societies they divide and connect. Ultimately, industrial borders exposed humanity's dual capacity to wield technological progress as a unifying force or a divisive one, often paving the way for large-scale conflicts that would define the 20th century. Borders in the 21st century are under intense strain, shaped by the forces of identity politics, climate change, and conflict. These interconnected pressures create borders that are more contested and dynamic than ever, demanding new ways of understanding and managing the divisions they represent. At the forefront of these pressures is identity politics, where debates over immigration, sovereignty, and cultural identity shape the narrative of borders. In many regions, migration is framed not just as an economic or humanitarian issue, but as a cultural threat. Political rhetoric amplifies these tensions, turning borders into symbols of protection or exclusion. The US-Mexico border is a prime example where walls and immigration policies are not only functional but also deeply political, reflecting divisions within and between nations over who belongs and who does not. Layered onto this is climate change, which is fundamentally reshaping migration patterns. Rising sea levels, desertification, and resource scarcity are displacing millions of people, challenging traditional border systems. The US-Mexico border highlights the impact of these environmental forces. Increasing droughts and desertification in Central America have driven migration northward, compounding already contentious political debates. Borders, once thought of as static lines, are now becoming pressure points in a global environmental crisis. These dynamics are further exacerbated by conflict, which often emerges from or intensifies these pressures. Climate change and resource scarcity can ignite tensions within and between nations, driving people from their homes. Identity politics can escalate into violence, especially when migration challenges long-standing notions of national identity. Conflict, in turn, forces mass migrations, creating crises that strain borders even further. The US-Mexico border again provides insight. As economic instability, environmental degradation, and political strife converge in parts of Central and South America, more people are forced to seek refuge, increasing tensions at the border. The interplay of these forces creates borders that are far from static. Climate change fuels migration, putting pressure on resources and challenging the capacity of border systems to respond. Identity politics shapes border policies, often emphasizing control and exclusion over adaptation and collaboration. Conflict intensifies these challenges, creating cycles of displacement and tension that reverberate across borders. The US-Mexico border exemplifies these pressures. It has become a flashpoint for debates over immigration and sovereignty, shaped by identity politics and environmental urgency. Climate-induced migration underscores the inadequacy of physical barriers alone to manage these challenges. Conflict, both within regions and over border policies, deepens the complexity of finding effective solutions. The lesson of pressured borders is one of interconnectedness. Borders today are shaped by forces that transcend geography, demanding strategies that address their root causes. Climate change requires global cooperation, not just localized enforcement. Identity politics needs reframing, focusing on shared humanity rather than divisive narratives. And conflict must be mitigated through diplomacy, resource equity, and sustainable development. In the 21st century, borders are no longer mere lines. They are dynamic systems, reflecting the tensions and challenges of our time. They force us to confront hard questions about identity, responsibility, and coexistence. How we manage these pressures will determine not just the future of borders, but the resilience and unity of the world itself. Our exploration of borders across history has revealed a powerful truth. Borders are never shaped by a single force. They emerge from the interplay of interconnected dynamics, a triad of influences that define not just the boundaries themselves, but the societies they enclose. Whether it was the balance of geography, resources, and identity in early societies, or the modern pressures of identity politics, climate change, and conflict, borders have always been the product of forces that reinforce and shape one another. This interconnectedness is the key to understanding the challenges of our current moment. Negative identity politics fuels conflict, which is exacerbated by the pressures of climate change. Migration driven by environmental degradation intensifies debates over sovereignty and identity, creating cycles of tension that strain our borders and divide our societies. These dynamics feed into one another, creating a feedback loop of pressure and division. But what we've also learned is that this interconnectedness works both ways. Just as negative forces can reinforce one another, so too can positive forces. By reimagining one aspect of this triad identity, we can begin to shift the entire system toward resilience and cooperation. A positive, inclusive identity is the starting point. If we move beyond narrow, exclusionary views of who belongs, we can redefine borders as places of connection rather than division. Inclusive identity fosters empathy, encouraging collaboration instead of competition. It creates space for shared solutions to global challenges, transforming borders from battlegrounds into bridges. This shift in identity can disrupt the cycle of conflict. Many modern disputes stem from a fear of losing cultural or national identity. But when we broaden that identity to include shared values, security, prosperity, and environmental stewardship, borders can become less contentious. By focusing on common goals, we reduce the tensions that fuel conflict and the displacement it causes. The same is true for climate change. The global nature of environmental challenges demands cooperation that transcends borders. An inclusive identity paves the way for joint efforts to address resource scarcity and climate-induced migration. By viewing the planet as a shared home rather than a collection of isolated territories, we can develop sustainable solutions that alleviate one of the greatest pressures on modern borders. What we propose is not a rejection of borders, but a reimagining of their purpose. History has shown us that borders are not fixed, they are dynamic, shaped by the values and priorities of the societies that create them. Today we have the opportunity to redefine borders not as barriers but as spaces of cooperation and exchange, places where differences are respected and commonalities are celebrated. This vision begins with recognizing the interconnectedness of our challenges. Identity, conflict, and climate change do not exist in isolation, and neither do the solutions. By embracing an inclusive identity, we can disrupt cycles of division and create a foundation for collaboration. We can transform borders from sources of pressure into catalysts for resilience and hope. The question we face is not just what kind of borders we want, but what kind of future we want to create. If we choose to reaffirm our shared humanity, we can shape a world where borders reflect not fear but connection, not division but unity. The choice is ours, and the time to act is now.